Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeremy Kowalski, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Geography Department here at York University, and it is my privilege to serve as the moderator for this event. As a point of departure, I would like to welcome everyone here to the opening plenary of the Arab Revolution's Crisis, Resistance, and Prospects Conference. This is certainly going to be an exciting event, which I am confident will not only prove to be an enlightening experience, but will illuminate various dimensions of the historical transformation currently underway in both the Middle East and North Africa that remain heretofore absent from and/or situated on the margins of dominant formal, practical, and popular commentary and analysis. I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce our guest speakers for this plenary session. Our first speaker, Dr. Radhika Desai, if you could please identify yourself, is a professor in the Political Studies Department at the University of Manitoba. Her work has found expression in the form of numerous books and academic journal articles. In fact, her most recent book, Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, Empire, has recently been released in actually this month. Her research interests include, but are not limited to, South Asian politics, cultural economics, and the history of economic thought. Our second speaker, Mr. Ali Mustafa, is an independent journalist based here in Toronto. He's a writer and media activist who specializes in Middle Eastern politics, where he has just spent the last year covering the events in Egypt and Israel and Palestine. He is currently the co-editor of Upping the Anti-Journal and has written many articles documenting the revolution in Egypt, including A Tribute to Tahrir Square, This is What Democracy Looks Like, and the Egyptian Revolution Continues, an interview with Hassam El-Hamalawi. His writing can be found at FromBeyondTheMargins.blogspot.com. Our third speaker, Dr. Eric Davis, is a professor of political science at Rutgers University and past director of the University Center for Middle Eastern Studies. His research has included the study of the relationship between state power and historical memory in modern Iraq, the political economy of Egyptian industrialization, the ideology and social basis of religious radical movements in Egypt and Israel, and the impact of oil wealth on the state and culture in Arab oil-producing countries. Dr. Davis's work has found expression in the form of, again, numerous books and academic journal articles, including Memories of State, Politics and Collective Identity in Iraq, Statecraft in the Middle East, Oil, Historical Memory and Popular Culture, and Taking Democracy Seriously in Iraq. Dr. Davis was also a member of an 8-nation study entitled Democracy and Development in the Arab World, which is conducted under the auspices of the World Bank and the American University in Beirut, which has recently been published in both Arabic and English. And our fourth speaker, who is currently en route from the airport, Dr. Kevin Anderson, is a professor of sociology, political science, and feminist studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. His work has found expression in the form of numerous books and academic journal articles, including Marx at the Margins, on nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies, and Foucault and the Iranian Revolution, Gender, and the Seductions of Islamism. His research interests include, but are not limited to, social and political theory, especially Marx, Hegel, Marxist humanism, the Frankfurt School, Foucault, and the Orientalism debate. So please join me in welcoming our guests to this event. However, before we proceed to our plenary discussion, I would like to outline the format for this session. Each speaker will have approximately 25 minutes to present. After our first two speakers, we will take a 10 to 15-minute break to stretch, visit the restroom, and/or inhale some fresh air. Following the break, our last two guests will present in succession. At the conclusion of the formal remarks by all of our guests, there will be a question and answer period. We ask that for those of you that would like to ask a question, to please approach one of the microphones which will be in the aisles to address the panel. When addressing the panel, please indicate to whom your question is directed and limit your remarks to a single question. Out of courtesy for other people who would like to ask a question, we respectfully request that you ask a question without taking license to editorialize or sermonize the subject. Of course, we expect that any person wishing to ask a question will do so in a tone and tenor that reflects the best traditions of academic decorum. Following the question and answer period, we'll collectively be given the opportunity to enjoy a short musical performance given by a local band of musicians, Kusha Nakai and Ibrahim Renems. I would like to now ask the sponsoring academic of this conference, Dr. Sab El-Nasri of the Political Science Department at York University, to come forward to offer his introductory remarks for both the conference and this plenary session.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Good afternoon. I'm extremely pleased and delighted, especially when we harvest the fruit of almost 1 year-long work, and when it comes to such a wonderful end, and I hope not the very end, because we'll have Saturday and Sunday too. I'm extremely pleased to have such remarkable scholars and activists as keynote speakers. I was thinking about my own introductory remarks. I thought maybe to focus on one essential thing about what's going on in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East, because this conference is not only about the Middle East, but also beyond. Struggles taking place in Europe, North America, South America, Asia, Africa, and so on. So one might argue we are witnessing for the first time in history a real international of people cross-referencing to each other in their own struggle, which is something marvelous we didn't witness probably for centuries. So my speech will be organized around this term struggle, because the struggle of people, not only in the Middle East in general, is the material out of which we tailor our knowledge and finding, academic as well as political. But the findings and knowledge are neither a mere reflection of this reality nor a simple description, as if human reality is nothing other than an expressive totality, as Louis Althusser used to put it. Insofar as our knowledge and finding represent an intervention in the contested situation, they not only contribute to our understanding of it, but represent an orientation for action when the involved actors deem them relevant to their own struggle. Having said that, analysis are no substitute for real struggle. To date, the development of real democratic alternative has been suppressed by the permanent and multiple form of intervention of imperialist power and a dominant Islamic political form. When we look at Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, and so on. With the Arab revolutions, both the still existing conservative regimes and as well as their conservative opponents, both under massive global and national political pressure, will find themselves in an increasing crisis of legitimacy, and thus will be compelled to reconsider the political strategies and calculation of power they have pursued thus far. They can't but follow a new liberal course of development under the compulsions of the emerging geopolitical transformations, which will contribute to the further intensification of this struggle, simply because you can't solve the crisis with the same means that caused the crisis in the first place. Kind of vicious circle, which is good for the social struggle. So the ideological construct of what I have termed long ago Islamic democracy is presented as the recognition of cultural particularities. However, it's not the structural limit of liberal democracy that is being conveyed by this, i.e., its non-universalization, but conversely, its claim to a normative universalities on a global scale. This is consistent from the point of view of the political and economic classes in the metropolis, but also from the view of the strategists in the IMF and World Bank, because the top-down decreting of a neoliberal structuring in the 80s and 90s did not lead, as claimed, to more affluence and debt reduction, but conversely to more poverty, over-independence, and repression. Neoliberalism thus must be politically and culturally interiorized. In this sense, Islamic democracies mean more effective political control and cultural disciplining as part of a new phase of a neoliberal restructuring. Thus, the missionaries of the old Roman Catholic missionarism, which represented the cultural justification for the wars or clash of civilization, then less cynical, the war of conquest and colonialization, the medieval crusades and the reconquistas are being virtually superseded, in Hegelian terms, aufgehoben, but in a neoliberal sense. Yet, the contradictory development, indeed, the intensification of the political and social struggle in the Arab and other Middle Eastern societies could mark a transition to a post-authoritarian phase, which for the first time indicates, opens possibilities for other political approaches that can be articulated by popular forces positioned politically to the left of the political spectrum. This opening of the political space enables other actors to popularize political forms which admittedly are neither arbitrarily constructible nor happen in a form determined without alternative, but instead implies protracted hegemonic political contestations and conflicts. Since the direction of the political development in this region depends on the outcome of these struggles and their condensation, institutionalization, it's more certainly worthwhile to further pursue the problematic and to investigate empirically, critically, concretely the detailed project related to each particular social formation. The tendencies outlined here can finally be sharpened into a hypothesis whose rationality can only be inferred by future political praxis itself and not a priori. Thus, one should not close the horizon of the possibilities of the present situation by an objectivistic or culturalist analysis, but try to determine the conditioning for it from a critical perspective of power relation. A peaceful and a just solution is possible even if arriving at it will be anything but free of conflicts. In face of the violent and destructive character of the current situation, the increasing number of civilian victims, and the depressing news the media brings daily, this appears no doubt to be naive. However, the appearance of naivety is contingent upon the time horizon that inform our interpretations, the social forces with which one associates, and the form one brings him or herself in, would co-decide about the historical course of the events. Our analysis must place the ongoing struggle at its center. How the contradictions, however, concretely develop or get critical, and how the oppressed act, how they make the best out of the situation for further development, determine the course of the conflict and the forms of political change. The global strategic question is whether or how it is possible that in the present crisis, the forces of the transition for a situation which could come to a radical break with the current status quo could be strengthened. One way of doing this is to engage critically and self-critically with this struggle and draw lessons learned for further struggles. To try to determine against the hegemonial shutdown of the still subordinate, already subversive, tendentious articulation of spirit of splitting gramsci forces of an alternative historical bloc, organizing themselves autonomously to speak in this sense of a post-situation's mean to establish the concrete possibilities of change of the relation of forces and their constellation in which several political projects could coexist, placing the struggles themselves in the foreground of the necessary, always biased analysis, though a lot of academics would argue the other one, or necessary always biased analysis. This optimistic scenario, in this respect, is part of these struggles. I will end with one of my favorite quotes of a certain Karl Marx, with a minor modification to the English translation for Menschen in Germans mean people, not men. So people, quote, make their own history, but they don't make it just as they please. They don't make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations wakes like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Karl Marx, the 18th Premier of Louis Boulada. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. El-Nasri. And without further ado, and gilding the lily, as it were, I'd like to ask Retika to come forward, please, and share your remarks with us.
Okay, well, first of all, let me thank Sabah and all the wonderful student organizers of this conference, which I'm very much looking forward to. And I'm particularly pleased that I'm going to speak first, and then I can stop worrying about my speech and pay attention to everybody else. I'm very happy also to hear what Sabah had to say, because I think that you will find that at least there are some themes in what he had to say, particularly about struggles and how struggles are central to the making of history, which hopefully you will find also resonate with what I have to say. The title of my talk is The Geopolitical Economy of the Arab Revolutions. And I will, without further prefatory remarks, just jump right into it. The Arab revolutions that opened the second decade of the 21st century are pregnant with more possibilities for progressive, anti-imperialist, democratic, and egalitarian historical change in the region than any event for many decades. However, the work of history is not the blind work of impersonal forces, but of conscious women and men armed with a reasonably accurate understanding of the historical moment. However, such consciousness is today not exactly in plentiful supply in a region which has suffered uncountable setbacks on practically every front in recent decades. Ejaz Ahmed, who we are so sad to hear couldn't come due to ill health, but in his various writings on these events, at one point, he identified a very important problem, I think very accurately, and here I'm quoting him. The dilemma of the middle-class youth who have risen so heroically against these servant dictators, he's referring to people like Mubarak, is that they are themselves products of American liberalism. The rhetoric of democratic reform that periodically emanates from the high and mighty in Washington inspires them, as does Barack Obama's slogan of change, contentless, but delivered with great rhetorical aplomb. They look at the US as a harbinger of democracy and hope that if they make enough noise and trouble in the streets, and if they can demonstrate the magnitude of protesting numbers, Obama will somehow dismiss the likes of Mubarak from imperial service. Obviously, this is a slightly dated quote, but I think it does identify an important issue we must deal with. If the values of freedom and democracy are to be rescued from their thraldom in US discourse, we need an understanding of the history of the region and of its place in the world order, which exposes the conceits and hypocrisies of US and Western discourses. While I cannot claim to be any sort of expert on the national histories of this region, in this talk I attempt at providing what I call a geopolitical economy of the Arab revolutions. In doing so, I wish to convey two key messages. First, the progressive potential of the Arab revolutions will only be fulfilled if the task of rebuilding the economies and societies on a more productive and egalitarian basis is taken up. This task requires a mature commitment to political organization and economic planning, a requirement that often runs athwart the current vogue for networked and decentralized forms of power and Proudhonist forms of economics. It requires a critical appropriation of the legacy of an earlier age of Arab nationalism. Secondly, the strength of imperialist forces, which will undoubtedly oppose such a rebuilding, while not inconsiderable, is far less formidable than recently dominant discourses would have us believe. The 21st century opened with a quantum leap in the scale and intensity of US imperial interventions in the Middle East and North Africa region. The Bush administration went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the Second Intifada inaugurated a new phase of heavily lopsided US intervention in Palestine. However, a few short years later, this new imperialism was bogged down in the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan, and by 2008, in an as yet unresolved financial and economic crisis. It was in this context that the series of Arab revolutions began, bringing down hated dictators supported by the US and threatening the imperial order in the region. However, no order dies a willing death. And in the 2 years since these revolutions began, the US has supported a war in Libya and is now supporting proxy wars in Syria and Mali, not to mention undertaking uncounted and uncountable covert operations across the region. These interventions use the metaphor of an Arab Spring to advance imperial goals behind the Arab revolutions. How effective have they been? It is safe to say that the neoconservative claim that the Arab Spring is simply following the example of the democracy that the Bush administration installed in Iraq is ludicrous. However, the claims of the so-called Obamians, as one writer calls them, it's a bit of a tongue twister actually, but anyway, the small network of close aides who provide a window into Obama's ideas and reasoning, which is the dominant influence on the Obama administration's foreign policy. These are quotes from James Mann's book of that title. Their claims that the revolutionary events represent the fulfillment of the new president's Cairo speech are widely credited, if often cynically. Most left-wing and critical writing either evades the question of change in the degree of imperial control or assumes that there has been none. Indeed, some, like the vast swathes of the left that supported the US-led intervention in Kosovo, not only assume that the US government remains largely in control of events in the Middle East, but also appear to believe that it should. And if some see US influence slipping, they attribute it to the imperial overstretch under the Bush Jr. administration, something that can and likely will be rectified by a more cautious and calculating Obama administration. The argument I want to make today takes a radically different perspective. It's based on my recently published Geopolitical Economy, After US Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, in which I question prevailing wisdom about the nature of the capitalist world order in a way that makes the contemporary emergence of multipolarity comprehensible. In this perspective, the Arab revolutions appear not as a singular set of events, but only the latest installment in a long history of anti-imperialism in the region, whose earlier chapters include the conflict over Suez and the nationalization of oil industries, just to take two examples. Geopolitical economy argues inter alia that contrary to the cosmopolitan one-world discourses, and here I include in this category free trade, hegemony, stability theory, both in its mainstream and world systems versions, as well as globalization and empire. Contrary to these discourses, geopolitical economy argues that states, as nationally organized blocks of capital, have played central roles in shaping the capitalist world order. And this, the capitalist world order that is, I conceive, along with Marx, as what he called, quote, the relations of producing nations, unquote. Which is why one of the reasons why I use the expression geopolitical economy, because these relations are at once economic and political, and we have a long-standing tendency to analyze these two things quite separately. These cosmopolitan discourses have served less to comprehend the world order than to articulate and justify actual or attempted domination over it by a single power. That is why in them, either no state matters, as in free trade or globalization, or only one state does, as in hegemony, stability theory, and its most recent epigony, empire. My critique builds on dissenting intellectual traditions, among whom I include Marx, One of the points that I make, which may perhaps surprise some, but perhaps not someone like Kevin Anderson, who is yet to get here, is that you find, if you read Marx properly, Marx points out that under capitalism, it is not just classes that oppress other classes, but also nations that oppress other nations. So anyway, among these dissenting intellectual traditions, I include Marx, the classical theorists of imperialism, the Bolshevik account of uneven and combined development, critics of neoclassical economics such as Keynes and Polanyi, the sprawling recent literature on the developmental states, and the economic history of Robert Brenner, to name just a few. The alternative account of the capitalist world order I build with these resources understands the evolution of that order as a dialectic of uneven and combined development, in which combined development, including combined capitalist development, as well as transitions of backward countries to socialism, plays a critical role. And it's worth emphasizing that either in the mainstream literature, which talks about uneven and combined development, either combined development is entirely forgotten, or its meaning is restricted to understanding the transition of backward countries to socialism. So that the entire issue of what you get when you get capitalist combined development is completely evaded. So combined development ensured that while British dominance in the early decades following the Industrial Revolution was inevitable, after all, England industrialized in a world which was still largely pre-industrial. That was a no-brainer. Of course, it had a productive dominance. So while this was in the early decades, such productive dominance by the UK was inevitable, the combined development of contender powers, the US, Germany, and Japan preeminently, would also make it unrepeatable. For that combined development already made the world multipolar. This is what the most penetrating writing of the time, ranging from that of the social reformer John Hobson to Marxists such as Lenin, Hilferding, Bukharin, and Luxemburg, which constituted the first theories of international relations on the new competitive imperialism, was all about. At a time when territories with weak or no states remained available for colonization, industrial competition between a plurality of major capitalist powers was bound to issue into imperial competition. However, in the course of what Arno Meyer called the 30 Years' War of the 20th century, he's referring to the period from 1914 to 1945, this multipolarity appeared to mutate into what has since been termed US hegemony. Charles Beard and William Appleman Williams, in very different periods and in different modes, had long argued that the US had always conceived of itself as an expanding empire. And by the early 20th century, it had reformulated its expansionary aims into a desire to emulate 19th century British dominance for the 20th century, at a time when British dominance was already widely recognized to be waning. Since for this latecomer on the new imperialism scene, formal colonization was more or less out of the question, this mimesis had to take a light form. And the US settled for trying to replace sterling with the dollar as the world's currency, and London with New York as its financial center. The underlying idea was that doing business anywhere in the world would be for US corporations, as it had been for UK companies, more or less like doing business at home. And it would be facilitated by the worldwide reach that New York's financial institutions would acquire. However, even this reduced ambition could not be attempted until the two world wars had increased US relative power by raining destruction on other capitalist powers and boosting US productive capacity. Geopolitical economy's final argument is that the story of post-war world capitalism makes most sense when told as a series of failed attempts by the US to establish and maintain the dollar as the world's money. Even the alleged peak of US power in the 1950s and 60s, the dollar's career as the world's money, was deeply troubled. A dollar shortage was followed by a glut of unwanted dollars and led eventually to the closing of the gold window. The reason was quite simply that the US was a national, not an imperial economy. That is to say, the only reason Britain could furnish the world with liquidity in the form of sterling was because it was able to export colonial surpluses as capital. The US had no such opportunities. The reason, therefore, quite simply was that the US was a national, not an imperial economy, and the world, too, was no longer imperial, but one in which combined development was a reality, not least because of the existence of the USSR, the strongest form of combined development to date. That is why the most prescient analysts, to name a few, Chomsky, Kees van der Pijl, Fred Bloch, insist that post-war policy was aimed not just at communism, but also at national capitalisms. However, until the most recent financial and economic crisis, the US remained powerful enough to attempt to sustain the dollar's world role through a series of short-lived stratagems. The last two were globalization under the Clinton administration and empire under the George W. Bush administration. For post-war US dominance was undermined by combined development among its Cold War allies, but also in the developing world. That sort of combined development peaked in the caesura of the 1970s with the fracturing of the world economy into national capitalisms and, of course, socialisms, all straining at the US leash. While it was also through the launching of whether it was through the launching of the European snake, currency coordination, or the developing world's call for a new international economic order. The apparent restoration of the neoliberal decades that followed rested on a series of unstable financializations, please note the plural, which culminated in the current crisis. And while they imposed severe deflation on most of the world, those developing countries that were able to resist them continued their combined development, leading by the turn of the century to the rise of the BRICS and other emerging economies. The recent Great Recession and financial crisis accelerated it further and forced the recognition of the world's multipolarity. Today, arrangements for displacing the dollar in international payments are being made are being proposed and even made, from an expanded role for special drawing rights through barter and swap arrangements for trade financing to regional institutions for reserve pooling. While it is still difficult to tell exactly how long the dollar's already diminished role will linger, and it has certainly been prolonged by the crisis in the Eurozone, its fate is now governed by forces its makers cannot control. I wonder if I can just show you a couple of pictures just to make my point. How do I get it to? There it is. This chart just shows you the share of global foreign exchange transactions involving the dollar from roughly 90% in 2001 down to 62% in 2010. This is currency's share of global foreign exchange transactions. Again, this 84%, by the way, in 2010, it's not actually 84%, but it's 84 per 200. That is, so that in fact it's more like 42%. And here, just as an interesting picture here, this is the trade-weighted dollar index from 1970, which is right there, to 2012 or so, roughly the present point. I've just downloaded this graph from a Federal Reserve website. This is the peak of it at the point when the Plaza Accord was made, but this peak, of course, is based on Volcker shock interest rates. And since then, as you can see, the trajectory has been down. There is another peak here, and that is the globalization peak or the stock market bubble peak. And since then, you can see in the 2000s, the trajectory of the dollar has been downward all the time. So this turning point does not signal the end of imperialism, but certainly marks the end of a long era in the history of capitalist imperialism in which single powers could dominate or attempt to do so. Geopolitical economy's account of capitalist imperialism has implications for how we conceive 21st century imperialism. The materiality of nations argument, as I call the first argument, focuses on the challenges to imperial power, including unspectacular and subsequently reversed ones, and on their lasting gains, however meager they may be. The inevitability, unrepeatability argument should break our habit of assuming that one hegemony will naturally be replaced by another one. And the failed attempts argument should help us appreciate the debility of the US economy and state and the limits of its imperial reach, its still gargantuan capacity to rain destruction around the world notwithstanding. Now we are ready to elaborate on the geopolitical economy of the Arab revolutions. We begin with the important fact that the MENA region was the last major region of the world to be absorbed into the system of capitalist imperialism because, and here I'm quoting Rashid Khalidi, alone among the major regions of the world, it bordered directly on Europe and was thus an object of the dueling and contradictory ambitions, not only of the two greatest global empires of the age, Britain and France, but also of the neighboring Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, as well as of nearby Italy and fellow imperialist latecomer Germany after their respective unifications in 1870. Of the two chief drivers of US policy in the region, oil and Israel, oil and more generally other economic opportunities for imperialist capital come first. Arguably, they also enjoy primacy. The great powers were only beginning to partition the region in the early 20th century, with Egypt falling into, with Egypt and Iran falling into the British sphere, Morocco into the French, and Central Asia into the Russian, when oil acquired its modern importance. This was when the Royal Navy made a strategic decision to shift to oil-fired battleships. In the First World War, it was widely understood control over oil made the difference between victory and defeat, and that realization reshaped the region. Several things may be noted. Despite the West's newfound eagerness for oil, the dialectic of uneven and combined development had reached a point where imperial arrangements had to leave the Turkish Republic, the new Turkish Republic, and Iran as independent states. Secondly, the mandates system represented a wider international conjuncture in the unfolding dialectic of uneven and combined development, which had made colonialism deeply illegitimate. And finally, and by the way, and in this process, the Bolshevik Revolution had a very, very critical role to play. And the peace decrees and their insistence on their anti-imperialist position generally. Finally, though imperial conquest over the rest of the region prevailed, the British decision to jettison direct colonial rule in favor of establishing a native kingdom in Iraq showed, as it was just an example, but this sort of example showed that popular resistance to imperialism was, from the start, a major factor in the situation. Contrary to the hegemony stability story, while the US undoubtedly sought to inherit the British imperial mantle, and by all accounts, the British on the whole sought to facilitate the project, this is the real content of what we today call the special relationship, the post-war US role was far from hegemonic. The limits in the Middle East were manifest in the establishment of radical nationalist regimes in the region, the Suez Crisis of 1956, the nationalization of oil industries beginning in Iran in 1951, Iraq in 1961, and Egypt in 1962, and beginning in 1967, the sponsorship of the Palestinian cause by the radical regimes of the region. While these forces of combined development of communism and nationalism, with these forces of combined development of communism and nationalism raged against it, only US control over the swing producer, Saudi Arabia, kept oil prices at the low levels that were so important to the golden age of capitalist growth. And the US approach to the question of Israel and Palestine remained even-handed, that of an honest broker. The lineaments of the contemporary lineup of forces in the region emerged only after the Six-Day War, and even more after the Yom Kippur War. So Israel became central to US policy in the region just when declinism became the dominant assessment of the US world role. The US had closed the gold window after fighting a losing battle to maintain the dollar's gold backing. The era of stagflation, which turned out to be the onset of what Robert Brenner calls the Long Downturn, had begun. Oil prices were quadrupled amid rising tensions between the US and its Arab as well as European allies. And the US lost a major war to a nation of what were essentially peasants. Things seemed only to get worse over the decade. The loss of unilateral economic policy prerogatives could be seen in the beginning of the contentious G7 meetings, the Iran hostage crisis, the nose-diving dollar, and the Volcker shock, which was necessary to rectify it. And the 1980s, for all the hype about Reagan's restoration, replaced the none too spectacular US industrial and export performance of the golden age with outright deindustrialization, as Japan bought access to US markets in return for being the US's greatest creditor, while the financialized pattern of US growth that now began culminated in the 1987 stock market crash. By 1991, the economy of the alleged victor of the Cold War had entered the doldrums, such that George Bush Sr., the incumbent president who had won the Cold War, lost an it's the economy stupid election to his Democratic challenger. And this, as I detail in my book, was followed by two further phases of bubble-driven growth, which have today landed the US in the economic mess it finds itself in. The development which would lead US military hubris to eventually take leave of economic realities, this development is basically the migration of the US military hawks, known today as neoconservatives, from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, is contemporaneous with these developments. They also became closely allied to what Mearsheimer and Walt called the Israel lobby. Essentially, since the mid-1970s, while US foreign economic policy would henceforth be focused on contriving one stratagem after another to keep the dollar status as the world's currency, its military policy would increasingly be driven by a cabal that had avowedly, that is to say by their own account, taken leave of the reality-based community. If US policy in the Middle East is driven by oil and Israel, the transmissions are of qualitatively different sorts. While one can detect some modicum of rationality in the case of oil, such rationality is much less apparent in the second case. Indeed, it is the absurdity of the US policy on Israel that led Mearsheimer and Walt to propose the existence of this Israel lobby. To be sure, it had a certain rationality to begin with. When the war in Vietnam was going badly, a potent Israel that had routed the Arabs in 1967 came to be attractive to the United States as a proxy stick with which to beat Soviet proxies in the Middle East. And early on, US policy in the region even produced victories for the US. The quadrupling of oil prices, for example, was matched by an agreement between the US and the major OPEC countries that they would deposit their oil surpluses in Western banks, thus backstopping the downward sliding dollar. And the most important of these regimes, the Egyptian, was won over to the US side and signed a separate peace with Israel in the 1979 Camp David Accords. However, the positive effect of the agreement on recycling petrodollars had worn off by the end of the decade, necessitating the recession-inducing Volcker shock. While winning Egypt over only set the US on a path which inflamed Arab and Islamic opinion and jeopardized not only US security, but that of much of the rest of the world. And this was a quote from Mearsheimer and Waltz. The 1980s coincidence of right-wing governments in both Washington and Tel Aviv meant that Israel now pursued an aggressive settlement policy, invaded Lebanon to root out PLO bases there, and attempted to set up a client government, all with US connivance. The intolerable burdens this put on the Palestinians resulted in the First Intifada, and eventually the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO, under which final status issues such as sovereignty and statehood and Jerusalem were deferred in return for what was called self-government over dozens of scraps of territory, divided by Israeli checkpoints that would become increasingly heavily militarized. From here on, even a change in government in Washington would make no difference. Though the Republicans had lost the 1992 elections, the neoconservatives left behind an important legacy, the 1992 Defense Policy Guidance. Just when US economic weakness and its newfound dispensability after the end of the Cold War were forcing the US to fight the Gulf War against Iraq with Saudi financing and a ragtag coalition of the willing, the 1992 defense policy guidance aimed to keep the US, quote, the predominant outside power in the Middle East, unquote, so as to preserve, quote, Western and US access to the region's oil, unquote. Theirs would be done even under a Clinton administration, for it represented a Democratic Party which had accepted the policy and electoral terms of the Reagan Revolution, and thus a new cross-party consensus on most aspects of policy, above all economic and military policy. Though many have noted that the new imperialism of the Bush administration well predated 9/11 in the project of the new American century and so on, fewer have noticed the deeper continuities between the Clinton and Bush administrations, which were evinced by the US's unilateralism over Kosovo, its initiation of the bombing campaign in Iraq, and the passage of the Iraq Liberation Act in 1998, which committed the US to regime change in that country. Our whistle-stop tour of US imperialism in the Middle East has finally brought us to the more familiar terrain of the 2000s and Bush's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and two things are important here. As is now being increasingly widely recognized, although it's not completely accepted, for all its awesome and destructive power, the empire project, like the globalization project before it, as I show in Geopolitical Economy, has been a failure of which the Arab revolutions are a major symptom. And secondly, the Obama administration's foreign policy is no different from that of the Bush administration in terms of its motives. The real difference lies in ever-narrowing resources and options for pursuing it. To make the first point, I need do little than recall the late Giovanni Arrighi's verdict on Bush Jr.'s empire. Although the initial shock and awe campaign appeared to succeed, by June 2003, and I'm quoting large bits of Arrighi here, US casualties began to increase, slowly but relentlessly. Worse still, political and economic returns per casualty declined precipitously, as US plans to remake Iraq to suit American interests clashed with the realities on the ground and had to be revised, downsized, or abandoned. The Iraq War had been an attempt to restore US military credibility after the defeat in Vietnam, and this failure, and it's interesting, isn't it, how even its critics shy away from calling it a defeat. This failure is, quote, far greater and less remediable than that in Vietnam. For Iraq is not Vietnam, and 2003 is not 1968. And again quoting Arrighi, in purely military terms, the Iraqi insurgents, unlike the Vietnamese, do not field heavy armored vehicles, nor do they have long experience of guerrilla warfare in a favorable natural environment, or enjoy the support of a superpower like the USSR. Moreover, since Vietnam, the US military was professionalized and became far more technologically advanced. This was the army that was failing in Iraq. The reasons for this are twofold. On the US side, the increasing reliance on what I call capital-intensive warfare is itself a result of the inability of the US state to motivate enough of its citizens to serve the imperial cause, has been, as interestingly conservatives like Andrew Bakovich have so eloquently detailed, doomed to fail. On the Iraqi side, contrary to innumerable attempts, scholarly and journalistic, to cast doubt on the nationhood of countries of the Middle East and of the Third World in general, it's quite interesting when coming from India, when I first encountered this tendency, and it's always puzzled me. I think I'm now getting to understand where it comes from, but this tendency to say, oh, the countries of the Third World are not really countries, usually by pointing to the artificial nature of their, and imperial nature of their boundaries. Contrary to this tendency, and here I'm quoting Rashid Khalidi, over several generations, states that often unsuccessfully battled foreign control and occupation, states that were also weak and ruled over diverse and divided populations, were nevertheless able to employ the powerful tools of a national education system and all the other means available to a modern state for shaping opinion for national purposes. This helped create loyalty to entities that have now a remarkable solidity, although none of them existed as independent sovereign units 100 years ago. And to this, I would merely add that I think that if you look at it from the perspective of uneven and combined development, the fact that a modern nation, whatever it is, however incongruous it may be internally and so on, it's also a community of economic destiny. And in that sense, I mean, today, if you read writings on inequality, your national belonging is a far greater determinant of your level of material, your material well-being than is your class belonging. Anyway, to go further, Khalidi singles out two countries as exemplars of this development: Lebanon, which had weathered extraordinary internal and external stresses, and Iraq, which, in spite of 3 wrenching and painful wars in just over 20 years and powerful challenges to its internal cohesion, seems to have developed a strong sense of national identity. That's why, as Noam Chomsky put it in a recent interview, the United States was seriously defeated in Iraq by Iraqi nationalism. Mostly by nonviolent resistance, step by step, Iraq was able to dismantle the controls put in place by the occupying forces. In November 2007, the Bush II administration came out with an official declaration about what any future arrangement in Iraq would have to be. It had 2 major requirements. One, that the United States must be free to carry out combat operations from its military bases, which it would retain. And 2, encouraging the flow of foreign investments into Iraq, especially American investments. A couple of months later, in the face of Iraqi resistance, the United States had to give that up. Iraq was an attempt to reinstitute by force something like the old system of control, but it was beaten back. In general, I think, US policies remain constant going back to the Second World War, but the capacity to implement them is failing. That's the end of the Chomsky quote. The changes we are witnessing in US policy is not contra James Mann and his conception of a new, more cautious Obama US foreign policy. Rather, as Andrew Bakevich has argued, 4 real developments are forcing change on a Washington which remains as yet not quite capable of recognizing them. First, as Bakevich has argued, the freedom agenda, which sought to reshape the Middle East to complement US economic and geostrategic needs, has collapsed. The US can only claim victory by surreptitiously lowering the requirements of victory. And one may add the people of Tunisia and Egypt underlined an important truth, that democracy is the work of the masses, not of would-be imperial powers. Second, the Great Recession, unlike other periodic downturns in US history, appears intractable. And this has implications for the ability of the US to sustain its gargantuan military budget, not least because of the prolonged recession, not least because the prolonged recession has begun to hurt middle as well as working classes, and is making questions about who has paid the costs and who has enjoyed the benefits of the past decades of widening economic disparities and bubble-driven growth at home and militarism and war abroad. These questions can only be postponed for so long. The limited liability patriotism, this is a wonderful label of Andrew Bakevich's, under which most citizens of a nation at war enjoyed credit-fueled consumption while sticking, I support the soldiers in Iraq stickers on their fancy new cars, while a small minority served repeated tours of duty can no longer be postponed. Sorry, can no longer be repeated. That this sort of experience cannot be repeated. As this conference opens, the axe of sequestration is already falling on at least some parts of the military budget. Third, the lid taken off by the Arab revolutions cannot be put back on again, not militarily and not through deceptions and ruses. And finally, other powers, such as China, preeminently, but also Russia, now stand in the way of the achievement of US objectives in the Middle East as elsewhere, as the instance of Syria most preeminently shows. There is also the potential for disagreements among the so-called triad between Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. None of this is to say that US and Western powers, and even newly emerging powers, will not continue to attempt to impose their will. That is indeed what imperialism is. It is, however, to say that for those who oppose them, the twin luxuries of complacent and convenient cynicism, the assumption that Western imperialism has it all wrapped up anyway, if that's what we believe, why are we even here? Why are we trying to, resist anything? And so that's one luxury. And the second luxury of informal network political activity have just become unaffordable to those who wish to take up the opportunities this newest and most hopeful historical turn of events affords. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika. I'd like to ask Ali Mustafa to come forward, please.
Hi, everyone. I just want to first begin by thanking the organizers, Professor Al-Nasri, many of the students here who had a hand in this conference, and all of you for being here today. Also, I should note that, unfortunately, due to another engagement that overlaps with tonight's talk, I'll have to leave a little bit early, so I do want to apologize for that. And I'll also have to limit my remarks a bit as a result. So firstly, I just want to highlight the fact that what's happening in Egypt right now is part of a long and ongoing process that is far from complete. And it's important to realize that 2 years after the fall of the former dictator Hosni Mubarak, Egyptians are still taking to the streets en masse to fight for bread, freedom, and social justice, the original rallying cry of the revolution. In fact, labor strikes, mass protests, and even ongoing clashes with the state security forces in opposition to the ruling regime have only intensified in recent months. Since coming to power, the first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, has really failed to live up to the historic opportunity before him. He actually has done far more to consolidate his own grip on power and that of the Muslim Brotherhood from which he hails more than anything else. This really represents what many analysts have called the equanization or brotherhoodization of the state, in which many of the key government posts that until today remain unreformed from the previous regime have been filled by Muslim Brotherhood members or so-called adherents to political Islam or Islamists. And really what this does is reproduce the internal Muslim Brotherhood structure within the apparatus of the state, very top-down, bureaucratic, and demagogic to a large degree. So at the same time, it's also important to note that this has been since the beginning part of the Muslim Brotherhood's keys to success as players in the revolution. It's because of the fact that they were so much more organized than the rest of the sectors of civil society, grassroots movements, and political parties that they were really able to launchpad themselves into such a prominent role in the key phase of the transition process. Since in this past year, since Morsi has been in power, we've seen various decisions that have not come over very well with ordinary Egyptians and are indeed very troubling. Most prominent of which is the recent constitutional decree that was issued in this past November, in which basically Morsi usurped all of the legislative and executive powers within his own office and above any judicial oversight. We've seen also mass attacks on labor unions, again, using the mechanisms of legislation to curtail the right to strike and so forth, as well as I alluded to earlier, appointing key attachés or cadres from the Muslim Brotherhood in those positions in order to make that process happen. We've also seen a new protest law that is right now before the Shura Council and yet to be passed, but that, again, is very problematic and very much reminiscent of a lot of the tactics used by the previous regime under Mubarak and then later SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, where protests have to be announced in advance. Only a limited amount of people are able to participate, and any type of denunciation of the state or government officials can leave protesters liable to arrest and imprisonment and so forth. Again, so what this really signals is more of a continuation rather than departure with the past. Also, apart from that, part of the central to the Muslim Brotherhood's program right now on the economic front has been really nothing short of neoliberal orthodoxy. Right now, they're alongside these various measures I just outlined. There's also a new deal with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which will go through, and again, which will entail massive restructuring of the state, more so than has already been taking place, and which is only going to fall further onto the backs of the poor working class and those taking to the streets right now. This has again caused massive backlash, as can be imagined. Just a few months ago, there were massive protests, and which eventually led to clashes outside the presidential palace, right at the gates of power, so to speak, when actually the Muslim Brotherhood mobilized en masse to beat back the protesters using, really violent force and even detaining and ultimately torturing many of the people they captured. So in many ways, this signaled the Maspero moment for the Muslim Brotherhood. And here I'm alluding to a previous massacre that had happened in October 2011 when the army had brutally massacred over 20 mostly Coptic Christian civilians at a protest. And that was, again, caused a falling out of the people with the army at the time, who they had previously viewed as behind them and part of the revolution, which again we as we know now is far from the truth. So really, there's no going back. Any hope of the Muslim Brotherhood being treated as serious players in this revolution has all but faded away. And again, this reveals the reality to many Egyptians, but for others, it just confirms what they had already known to be true. But at the same time, I want to outline that the problem is much bigger than Morsi himself. All of the underlying structural flaws that have plagued Egypt for the past decades remain firmly in place. We're talking about mass poverty, chronic inequality, as well as systemic corruption at all levels of government. What we need to keep in mind now is that new democracies are not blank slates, right? To a large degree, the dynamics are inherited rather than decided, as has been outlined here. Here I'm referring specifically to the deep state of kind of a long-standing vestige of entrenched interests and privileges belonging mainly to, but not only the military. And again, nothing has really changed in that regard. This raises some inherent questions on on elections and liberal democracy more generally. Elections alone do not signal a break from the prevailing political and economic order. This is something we have to actually keep in mind. In many ways, without meaningful structural reform, they can end up not leading to change, but just consolidating the status quo under a new kind of guise, and that's exactly what we're seeing today. The key question, I guess, is that, is this something that Egyptians are going to accept? And as we've seen right now, that the answer is no. A lot of the key gains from the revolution have not come from on high, but rather from sustained popular pressure from below. And this is something that's continuing to this day. Egyptians refuse to back down. They've taken to the streets and really are not allowing politics as usual to continue, merely replacing one autocrat with another. I think this is a healthy sign to note, because it's taking place not in the context of a dictatorship or under Mubarak, or a transition being led by the military, which is part and parcel of that regime, but actually the first civilian democratically elected government. So that goes to show that the demands of the revolution really go beyond these kind of prescribed parameters of liberal democracy and are much broader in scope. What are the role of these clashes that we've seen taking place? It's a somewhat divisive question, but I think one thing is for certain, that they've done to a large degree, helped raise the price of dictatorship. They've made the status quo at present untenable, and have disrupted business as usual. At the same time, it's causing a lot of chaos, disorder, and instability. But that the price being paid is falling on the shoulders much more of the regime than the forces on the ground themselves, and that's something that must be noted. At the same time, the revolution has evolved, not only taking part in street clashes, but also various other forms of direct action, labor strikes, occupations, and the like. Even clashes themselves have now branched out from beyond Tahrir Square to as I said, the gates of power at the presidential palace and also other cities. What does this suggest? To me, I think it says a lot about how Tahrir Square can no longer be considered the barometer for the depth and breadth of support for the revolution, and that it's actually spread much further, and not only in Cairo, but other governorates as well. And this is a key point. Along with that, what we're seeing now is that people are no longer calling for the downfall of Morsi or the Muslim Brotherhood, but actually, as we've seen in places like Port Said, where things are really heating up, also in Mahala, a major industrial area were key to leading the revolution in the early stages, and also Shubra, which is a district of Cairo, have called for autonomy or independence from the Muslim Brotherhood state. Now, all of this is taking place, of course, at a very symbolic level with very little practical ramifications on the ground, but I think these are huge turning points in terms of the psyche or overall level of consciousness of Egyptians and where they think this revolution is going, and the complete lack of faith in the state structures as they currently exist, whether dictatorship or nominally democratic. Again, also it's important to say that in terms of how far we've come, the euphoria of those original 18 days that finally led to the ouster of Mubarak have faded. In reality, the unity we saw in Tahrir Square during that time actually concealed far more than it revealed. People are no longer one hand, as the saying used to go. Egypt is a lot more polarized than it has ever been before. At the same time, this has meant shifting alliances over time, in which the protest movement on the ground is very fluid and situational. Whereas before, clashes in Tahrir Square and Mohammed Mahmoud Street, directly off of it, were included the youth and also members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now we're seeing a completely different dynamic taking place. And also now there are secular individuals who make up large sectors of the protest movement who wouldn't be considered revolutionary, but actually falul or remnants or loyalists to the old regime, merely because of the fact that they oppose the Muslim Brotherhood and are opposed to this Islamic style of rule, let's say, that is being currently implemented. So again, all of these pose us with very interesting questions to consider about what is happening in the revolution right now. To end, I just want to say, because I am pressed for time, that what's happening right now in Egypt is a very long, difficult, and oftentimes contradictory process. But the revolution is far from over. It's merely entering a new phase. But I think, as we've seen over time, 2 years in, that the fault lines now are clearer than ever, and this is something that should give us hope and optimism in the coming weeks, months, and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break and then return to hear both from Eric Davis and Kevin Anderson. Thank you very much.